physical evidence in the case is critical. No question about it. Physical evidence may be open to interpretation, but it doesn't lie. And here's a piece of physical evidence that I cross-examined Dr. Balraj on, if you'll recall. I believe she's the forensic pathologist who did the autopsies on the ladies buried in the backyard, at least most of them, if not all. You'll have the autopsy reports. You'll see this for yourself. But the ladies in the backyard, one in the basement under the steps, and the one in the crawl space upstairs, they were all covered in mud, wrapped in plastic. You'll recall that. You remember Dr. Balraj? I asked her about unwrapping the plastic. Some of them had blankets. What was innermost on the body? What was innermost on the victim's bodies? Covered in mud. How does that happen? I mean, if the state's theory is right, that Mr. Sowell killed these women somewhere in his house and then wrapped them up in plastic and buried them, how does the mud get on their body? Covered, caked. What I think it suggests is that these women were buried somewhere, excavated, wrapped for movement, and then buried in the backyard. I mean, I don't know what else to make of that evidence. You folks will have to think about it. But there's mud covering the bodies, not the plastic. I mean, there was, obviously dirt on top of the plastic. The bodies are covered in mud. Look at that in the reports. I don't know what you do with it, but I think it suggests that those bodies were buried maybe somewhere else. We don't know because we don't have any soil samples. Can you imagine? You got dirt up on the third floor, dirt in the basement, these makeshift graves, basically. We don't know where the dirt came from. We don't know where the dirt came from because they didn't save any of it. To see if this dirt is similar to the dirt in the backyard or the dirt on the bodies. Is the dirt on the bodies the same as that on the third floor or in the basement or somewhere else? We just don't know because they didn't look. They didn't preserve it. They didn't do any soil analysis whatsoever. And amazingly, on the third floor, when they walked in and they see these bodies laying there, there's a shovel laying right on the floor. You'll see it in all the photos if you don't remember it. They saved that shovel. And if you look in the trace evidence reports, no testing. None. How could you not see if there are fingerprints on that shovel? How can you not see if that's soil, if there's some dirt or something on that shovel, and does it compare to anything? They did no testing. They had their man already. They didn't need to. And there's no doubt that these women were strangled. I mean, I don't think anybody's disputing that. But you haven't heard one bit of scientific evidence to say that when someone's strangled that they bleed. You didn't hear anybody testify about that. All right? And I suggest that if you didn't hear testimony about it, it's because it doesn't happen. They certainly would have brought that out. Strangulation, terrible death, no doubt. Unconscious after 15 to 30 seconds, I think the testimony was. There's no testimony that any of these women bled. And you've got the gray bed sheet. Where Diane Turner, if I'm not mistaken, there's some blood of hers on the sheet. But if you look at the photographs of all the underwear, if you remember that testimony, a lot of these women had very soiled underwear. That was found throughout the house. The sheet, I think it was presumptively positive for blood. It could have come from a lot of different ways. Certainly no evidence it came from any type of strangulation. None whatsoever. Just as likely that's completely unrelated to the homicide. And with respect to these ligatures, I think the prosecutor tried to bring out some testimony about the neck ligatures, especially that there was decomp material on the ligatures around the neck, therefore they couldn't be tested. Folks didn't even try. I mean, they didn't even try and say, okay, well, we tried, but we couldn't do it because of this. And there's ligatures around the ankles, ligatures around the wrist. On some of the victims, you'll see that. Okay? You'll see that. But remember Dr. Butt. He was the DNA guy, a really smart guy, I'm sure, to do that type of work. He said all you need is like a millimeter. A millimeter. That's like less than a speck of material to test for DNA. And you might not get a full profile, but you could get a partial profile. It might even be only male or female, but at least it's something. But you look at those ligatures, the photographs of those ligatures, maybe some around the neck, maybe. You know, I mean, just looking at it, I'm not an expert, maybe. But look at the ones around the wrist, look at the ones around the ankles. They didn't even try any of those. And all they need is a millimeter. Don't you want to know who tied these women up? And that's the best and easiest way to do it, is to do the testing. Just more about the crime scene, if I could. You know, we know where the bodies were found, but we don't know where these women were killed. I mean, we don't know where they were killed. We know where they were found. And I suggest to you, the prosecutor wants you to believe they were kidnapped because of these bindings. But we don't know. There's been no evidence that, like, these wrist bindings or these ankle bindings, these ligatures, we don't know when they were placed on the bodies. We don't. There's just no evidence of that. And I suggest to you that when you look at those bindings, they're there to transport the body from one place to another. You know, these bodies were bound, they were wrapped, and then they were carried somewhere. And by the way, was it one person who carried them or two? I mean, you look at when they're trying to get the bodies out of the ground, it's taking multiple people to, I mean, of course it's a grave, but, you know, to carry a human body and wrapped up in plastic like it is. I mean, did they talk to any of the neighbors about seeing any digging in the backyard? There's one or two photographs that'll make this point, but, you know, they're showing the backyard and there's a house directly behind it with what looks like a second floor porch, all right, which must look right down into the backyard. Was there any effort to interview those people? You might see anything out in the backyard at your neighbors? See any digging back there? See any, you know, unusual activity at all? I don't think there was. I mean, there's no evidence they even tried to talk to these people. It's just unbelievable. I mean, I think it goes to the point that this was not a highly organized crime scene investigation. It just wasn't. It wasn't methodical. It wasn't organized. It wasn't there to seize every bit of evidence that they could seize because they had their minds made up right away. And there's little to no protective clothing. It went on and on about that. But you heard the trace evidence, Locart's principle, you know, someone touches someone, moves here. You know, you heard all about that. But it's critical, and you look at these photos. Look at them. Take your time and look at them. There are people standing down, like where the graves were, in just regular boots, and who are these people? And something that just boggles my mind, there was testimony about this. I think it was from Mr. Jones, from the trace evidence, but there's still evidence out at the house that hasn't even been collected, let alone tested. And speaking about, you know, trace evidence, Chris Kern was the first gentleman who testified from trace. He now works in Washington State, I think was his testimony. If you recall his testimony, there was a moment where on cross-examination, I asked him about certain documents, certain parts of his trace evidence report. And I said, are these your notes from the trace evidence report? He said, oh no, those are Mr. Jones's initials at the top. I said, but it's in your report. He testified as if he had done it, as if he had made those observations, as if he had done the testing. He, on direct and almost all the way through cross, he acted as if he had done it. That's misleading, folks. That is completely misleading. And once someone like that misleads you, but for the fact that I cross-examined him with notes, not his final report, because you couldn't tell from his final report, you'll have to take a look at it. But for those notes, he would have walked right out of here leaving you the impression that he had done all that testing, all that observation he testified about, when in fact he had not. That is a serious credibility issue, folks. And it applies not only to him, but everyone else in that coroner's office. When you heard about the better practice Mr. Jones talked about, the better practice is to collect evidence and test it later in case you need it. There's still a lot of material out at that house that's never been collected, never been tested. And there's not one person from the coroner's office that's certified in crime scene investigation, and I think it's reflected here. DNA evidence, let's talk about that for a moment. Dr. Butt testified that he had male DNA in the house from 2 unknown people. Well, they certainly had Mr. Sowell's DNA, we know that. They had Mr. Henderson's DNA, the man who picked up the mail, you remember him. And they had all the women's DNA, but there are 2 unknown males in the house with their DNA. You'll have the autopsy reports, look at them, see if there's any external injuries on these victims. There's no stabbings, there's nothing like that. That's not in there. Mr. Sowell's DNA, he did give a sample. They had it, they used it, they tested it. His DNA is not anywhere on these homicide victims. His DNA, they never tested the ligature that I think it was Lala testified about. There's a photograph of it on the floor, and he didn't even test that. There are no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints. They tried, but they can't find them on those plastic bags. Two types of kidnapping, you've heard about that. The A3, the A4, you'll have those definitions, look at them carefully. What I suggest to you folks is that, you know, the kidnapping is not the restraint incidental to the strangulation. It has to be something more. I suppose with every strangulation there's restraint, by definition, all right? But these ligatures, the state wants you to believe, because there's wrist ligatures, there's ankle ligatures, that these were applied before the women died and they were restrained in some way. That's one possibility, I suppose, but we don't know that those ligatures were put on afterwards. We don't know if they were put on before. The evidence is equal on that point. It's equal. Because if it had been put on before, you know they would have had an expert up here saying so. And you got to keep in mind the bodies with the ligatures, where they were found, wrapped up in plastic. It makes sense that these bodies, after they were dead, they were tied as they were, wrapped up and moved. That's not a kidnapping. That's not a kidnapping. Folks, you're going to have the defense exhibits here. You've seen them all before. There are 2 you have not seen. They're stipulated. That means they're agreed exhibits. Take a moment to look at these. They're back there with you. Joint Exhibit 1, Stipulation Exhibit 1, is concerning Ms. Fortson. The important thing on the front of this is that she had a permanent ID issued by the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles on June 24th of 2009, which is different than I forget which doctor it was, may have been Paul Roger, I don't remember. You remember the date of death estimates. All right, this is a different date. All right, that's the importance there. It's that they didn't even check with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to help determine the time of death. They just took somebody at their word. And here it was on June 24th of 2009 when she was issued a permanent ID. Do with that what you will. These exhibits are pretty self-explanatory. I know you pay close attention. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I encourage you to take a look at them and use them in your deliberations. Folks, this is an incredible case in so many ways. Obviously, our community is horrified by the victims and what they had to go through and the number of victims. No question about that. But I think equally horrifying is the conduct of the Cleveland Police Department and the coroner's office in their investigation of this case. How they treated the family members of the victims before the bodies were found. How they treated the crime scene, I think, is reflective of something that we should not be proud of. They didn't process this crime scene as it should have been. They didn't even do the testing that should have been done. But they want you to convict this man of the most serious charges that the state of Ohio can bring with this type of investigation. I believe that after you carefully consider and compare all the evidence, after you look at those jury instructions carefully, take the time to understand them, you'll find that the state of Ohio has not proven the identity of the person who killed those women. They just haven't. If somehow you get beyond that and find Mr. Sowell is the killer. And I don't agree with that, but it doesn't matter what I agree with. If that's your finding, you then have to go and decide whether this was done with prior calculation and design or not, because it makes a difference under the law. And you have to determine whether these women were kidnapped or not, because it makes a difference under the law. And you have to consider all 80-plus charges individually, carefully, and we'll respect the decision you come back with. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, before I give the state the chance to argue and rebuttal, I will take a break so we don't have to interrupt that argument. We're almost at an hour anyway. Again, I'll instruct the jury to leave the notebooks and chairs.